Hey everyone, it's Mr. Casarino, and we are going to be doing our third video for this reverse classroom. In this, we're going to be looking at World War One, the home front during the war. You can see the Nash readings that corresponds with, and the Newman readings that corresponds with this little talk. Now, I promise all of you, I'm going to do my best to keep this to under 10 minutes. I think we can do it. So, without further ado, let's start by looking at public opinion. So, as we all know, to fight a war, you need to have support of your public, and Wilson understood this. And so, Wilson, being the progressive, realizes the organization and structure can accomplish things, creates the Committee on Public Information. Now, the Committee on Public Information is headed by a journalist named George Creel, who was a muckraker for a little bit, a political campaign advisor, but really makes his mark in history as being the head of the Committee on Public Information. And so what's the goal of the Committee on Public Information? The goal is to use every medium to persuade the public to back the war effort. So what they did is they enlisted the services of artists, writers, performers, and movie stars to depict the heroism of the boys, the US soldiers, and the villainy of the Kaiser or the Huns, the German side. They created posters, poems, songs, something a new technology that they really took advantage of was films. They began to implement films to kind of get this patriotic fervor going through the United States. And they were urging all Americans to watch out for German spies and to do your bit for the war. Some of the big artists that we associate this with, painters who did these posters, were James Flagg, Joel Pennell, Howard Christie, really two big singers who did a lot of songs, recorded songs for them, were Irving Berlin and George Cohan. You don't necessarily have to know them, but they're just good culturally to know. So, as you can imagine, that when you're pushing this public campaign of anti-German, pro-American sentiment, there's gonna be some war hysteria. And this war hysteria mainly affected those who opposed the war, ethnic minorities, especially German Americans, and other groups that weren't 100% American, which we'll talk about in a minute. So probably the most famous or infamous of these groups was the American Protectorate League, and they mounted a campaign called Hate the Hun. So you can imagine who that was targeting. And the Hate the Hun, they used vigilante actions and they attacked all things German, including, as we see from our Newman reading, playing Beethoven's music to cooking sauerkraut. And so again, targeting this German identity in the U.S. to ensure it was 100% Americanism. Uh, Under the order of the U.S. Secretary of Labor, manufacturers of war materials could refuse to hire and could fire American citizens of German origin. So again, you have a lot of anti-German sentiment in the country, which is actually being protected and promoted by the federal government. And so we get to this phrase 100% Americanism. So this is a phrase that comes out of World War One that's kind of like those, either you're with us or against us. You're 100% American. You aren't German American, you're American. And what we associate 100% Americanism with is often with native born, uh, Anglo-Saxon stock especially, and total loyalty and support for the United States during the war. No wavering at all. And you are just 100% behind the war effort. So these are a couple of the more famous, infamous posters that came out from the Committee of Public Information. I'm sure you've all seen Destroy This Mad Brute, Enlist. Uh, really don't need to go into too much depth with that. It's pretty obvious to see what's happening. On the right, Beat Back the Hun with Liberty bonds. Of course, those bonds that the US government used to finance the war. And you can see the bloody German Hun in the background creeping forward. And actually a big fear during this time was movies and novels were made that were showing German invasions of the United States. So Americans genuinely believed that there's an imminent German invasion on mainland United States. And that's what this propaganda did. It convinced the American public of a real threat to their peace at home. So let's take a quick look at the Selective Service Act. So the Selective Service Act was implemented by the Secretary of War Newton Baker to conscript or draft men into the Army. As we know, this isn't the first time it was used. It was used during the Civil War by the North and the South, and was met with a lot of hostilities often. But Baker and Woodrow Wilson didn't really see selective service as a bad thing. They actually argued that it was the most democratic form of enlistment because people were randomly selected. Every male between the ages of 21 and 30 had to register for the draft, and they would be randomly selected. There was no privilege, there was no getting out of this. It was the most democratic form of enlistment. That age later on will go between the ages of 18 and 45. And so they run selective service to make it more democratic. It's run by local boards, and these localities are expected to ensure that all the males between the ages of 21 and 30 and later 18 and 45 are registered for the draft. And you can see there on the right, it's a pretty common poster that you might see in your town. I have a poster from a Massachusetts enlistment that hangs above my wall. Maybe I'll bring it into class. But this is a typical thing that you might see. And within 2 months, though, 10 million men register. So men are flocking to register for the draft to serve overseas. And in the end, about 2.8 million are drafted. So that's on top of the 2 million who already volunteered. And about half of all those will wear the uniform overseas. So the Selective Service Act of 1917 was used to fill the need for soldiers and sailors for the Great War. But of course, it's met with some pushback. And so what we get for a war effort is the war is being, of course, opposed by at this point by many German Americans, but especially socialists and pacifists who really fight out against and raise objections to the fact that the United States is entering this conflict. And so you get two acts, which hopefully sound familiar from early on in the early republic of our history, is the Espionage Act of 1917. And what this did is it provided penalties of 20 years imprisonment and fines up to $10,000 for those convicted of interfering with military recruitment. So, in other words, those who were seen as obstructing the operation of the draft. And it's a very vague law, and that's kind of the point of it, so then they can implement it however they see fit. So again, clamping down on those who interfere with the draft. And then on top of that, you get the Sedition Act of 1918, which pretty much prohibited anyone from making disloyal or abusive remarks about the U.S. government. Again, very vague, but intentionally vague. And about 2,000 people were prosecuted under these laws. Perhaps most famously is Eugene V. Debs is arrested after giving a speech in Canton, Ohio, that was very critical of the war and encouraging people not to register for the draft. So he's arrested under the Espionage Act. And then there's this big Supreme Court case, and this is one of those maybe B-list ones that you need to know. And this is Schenck v. United States. So in Schenck v. United States, a man had been imprisoned for distributing pamphlets against the draft and for trying to get support to not support the war. And eventually he's arrested, and he appeals his case and eventually makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1919. Now, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes gives the majority remark in which they uphold the Sedition Acts as constitutionals. And the way they do this, because of course, Schenck comes in saying it's my First Amendment right, freedom of speech. Holmes and the other Supreme Court justices conclude that the right to free speech could be limited when it is represented a clear and present danger to public safety. So, freedom of speech is limited when there's a danger to public safety, kind of like you can't yell fire in a movie theater and say it's protected by your First Amendment rights. So let's take a quick look now at African Americans at home. The big takeaway from this is the Great Migration. Now, the Great Migration for us, looking here, we're just going to be looking at 1914, 1920, even those years are much larger, but just for this, we're going to be looking at 1914, 1920. And within the 6 year window, about 500,000 Southern blacks migrate to the North. And the reason they're doing this is because they need cheap labor to support the war industry. You no longer have that much European immigration, and a lot of the men are now overseas fighting. So northern businesses recruit cheap black labor to run these industries. And you know what? For the most part, African Americans are really excited to leave the South, and I hope that's obvious to you why they might be, because they're facing racial oppression, violence, lynchings, voter suppression, and living in these horrible conditions, and they think that they can improve their lot by going to the North and taking these jobs in these industries, and they'll be able to escape the racism and oppression of the South. Now, for a large part, they do improve their living conditions and their wages, but as you would imagine, they still face many difficulties and very ugly racism when they arrive in the North. And you know what? And African Americans too were split on whether or not to support the war. And a big thing here's a quote from the Afro American, a Maryland black run newspaper at the time said, "Let us have a real democracy for the United States, and then we can devise a house cleaning over on the other side of the water." So, what this is getting at is to say that here in the United States, we don't even have a truly free democracy, because look at how these African Americans are treated both in the North and the South. So how can you expect us to fight a war to protect democracy abroad when we don't even have it at home? However, many black leaders, including W.B. Du Bois, really see the war as an effort, as an opportunity to prove your patriotism to your country. And this is a theme reoccurring in U.S. history, that African Americans view wars as an opportunity to demonstrate their patriotism and their loyalty to hopefully secure civil rights at home. They see if they can fight and prove their worth abroad, then they can secure their rights at home. But they face a lot of violence at home. Probably the most infamous one is the St. Louis riot, which occurs in July 2nd, 1917. It lasts 4 days. Over 100 black people are killed, and in response, the NAACP has a famous protest. I didn't put this up here, but this is probably important for you to write down. It is called the Silent Protest. And in the silent protest, thousands of African Americans wearing black and white marched in New York City carrying signs asking Wilson, when will they get democracy at home? When will democracy be made safe for African Americans to protest this violence? There's a series of other riots that occur, especially targeting African American soldiers, because one thing you need to keep in mind are these northern blacks are now being stationed in the South where they're not used to the Jim Crow ways, and they're coming into conflict with the white power structure in the South, and there's a lot of violence surrounding that. So they're constantly facing violence, but even in this face of this violence, they're still willing to go out and fight for the United States. Uh-oh, it looks like I accidentally duplicated this without, so ignore this part. Women in World War One. Sorry about that last slide. I guess I made two copies, and like I said in class, once you start filming, you can't start over. You have to do one run. So women in World War One. With selective service, industry needed to fill thousands of jobs. So one, they looked towards African Americans, and two, they began to turn to women. So women, for the first time, are starting to do a lot of industrial jobs that were used to seen to be just solely for men, but without men to run them, they need to turn to women. And so, with this, sorry, Siri is going off right now. I apologize. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. My Siri just went off for whatever reason. So where were we? So women. So they turned to women for this labor force. So women for the first time taking on these male jobs. And for the first time too, is it's not just women from lower classes, but women from all of the classes come together to support the war effort, and they form organizations to support the war effort. One of the most famous ones is an African American women organization called the National Association of Colored Women, and they do Liberty Bond drives to raise money for the war effort. There's a whole bunch of organizations that are formed to support the war effort for Liberty Bonds. Women, as I'm sure you know, are actually hired by the Army and Navy to serve as nurses. And it's very highly organized and structured, and I think it'd be difficult to look at how the US would have fared if women had not been so organized. And a big thing they do too is they wear uniforms. And this might not seem like that much to you, but uniforms symbolize their credentials as citizens engaged in wartime service. It showed that what they were doing was real and what they were doing made a real difference. And so because of their efforts during World War I, a lot of historians will look to this is what really sways Woodrow Wilson to support the 19th Amendment or women's suffrage. So because of their efforts during this, because of their service, that's what's going to get the 19th Amendment passed. So that's that for this video. Sorry about those weird little glitches. Hopefully they won't throw you off too much. Oh, I forgot to have a random question to make sure you watch this video. So, what is my favorite type of dog? That's what I'm going to ask you tomorrow. What's my favorite type of dog? And it is a corgi. So just know that my favorite type of dog is a corgi. Sorry I didn't throw it in the middle. Anyway, thanks for watching. Sorry about those little bleeps, and we'll see you in class.